How we doing, everybody? I'm really excited, to be here with our Give and Go policy learning series with the NBA's and NBPA's Social Justice Coalition. This started in 2020. What the bubble did for us was we had a chance to just sit down and think. It can be hard for a professional athlete to do that, but it was that perfect opportunity. And when we saw what was occurring in our communities, the United States of America, it sparked something. I'll never forget Michelle Roberts speaking on how do we take this moment and make it impactful, because it's going to keep happening. The George Floyds, those social injustices that are constantly happening in our communities, but now it's happening right in front of us on the news. And so when the Milwaukee Bucks forfeited their game, it drew a large body of NBA players. From that, what better way than to come out with something impactful and positive? You're talking about changing policies. Our duty as professional athletes goes well beyond just showing up on the court, dunking the ball, shooting threes. Sports are for building community.
Thank you so much, Andre, and to the Players Association for hosting us here. Today is the second in our four-part series that we're calling our Give and Go Learning Policy Series. And we named it for foundational basketball skill. The idea being that we give you some information on social justice policy, and then hopefully you go and spread that to friends, neighbors, family, colleagues. Today, I'm really pleased that we get to have a conversation about impact in policing. Ultimately, the question of how social justice change and social policy change happen are what we answer in these kinds of conversations. It felt like the right time to have a conversation about alternatives to arrest, the right time to have a conversation about alternatives to incarceration with practitioners and policy experts who can guide us. I would love to introduce our moderator, Alencia Johnson.
So I'm just going to jump right in. I want to introduce the experts today. First, we have Mr. Ron Davis, who is a partner at 21CP Solutions, which is a team of nationally recognized thought leaders on public safety. He was the 12th director of the U.S. Marshal Service. Next, we have Max Markham, who is the executive director of the Policing Project. As executive director, he provides strategic leadership and oversees the organization's day-to-day operations and initiatives. So before we get started, take out your phones, get ready to scan this QR code, and take your guess. Around what percentage of 911 calls involve violent crime? 13%, 25%, 4%, or 50%? Max, I'd love for you to share with us the correct answer, and then also just tell us a little bit of why you got into this work as well.
Sure. You guys almost had it with the plurality, but it's 4%, and actually it's even less if you think about it. This is from the perspective of how police spend their time. That is 4% on violent crimes. The actual number of calls, percent of calls that come through, is closer to 1%. So it's very, very small. What actually makes up the vast majority of calls is non-criminal activity. So things like quality of life considerations, homelessness, mental health crises, property crime, towing, crashes. I am native New Yorker. I grew up, I matured as a man during the time of stop and frisk policing that unfortunately targeted, in many instances, young black men like myself, to a point where there were hundreds of thousands of stops. So that was kind of the context that I grew up with in sort of understanding policing and how I was viewed by police.
Ron, you've spent more than 28 years in local law enforcement. I didn't mean to put your age out there. What about your career and life in law enforcement inspired you to get involved in this work?
My father was a cop, so at an early age, I knew I wanted to be a cop. Most of my time in law enforcement was during the crack epidemic, and our response was literally arrest everything that moves. Right? Being on the street and making all these arrests and seeing it having no impact other than to further, quite frankly, harm the community is when I started thinking there has to be a different way. Doing a comparison to the medical field. If you ever go to the hospital for more than a day, you'd be lucky to see your doctor once a day. The doctor's not going to give you aspirins, not going to take your blood. You have other professionals for that. In policing, we have doctors giving out aspirins. We're using the police for everything that they're not designed to do, nor are they trained to do, because it's the easiest thing to do at 2 o'clock in the morning. I think the challenge for us with reform, and why I think it's so important, is in many ways, this is where we can come together. Those things together make us more effective in fighting crime and violence.
A little over 10 years ago, this conversation became a national conversation because of what happened in Ferguson to Mike Brown. President Obama responded to what was happening in Ferguson, and that's when he signed the executive order to create the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing. You were heavily involved in that. You could take us back to that moment in that conversation.
I think that collective outrage not just from any single group. We saw that it was a very multicultural, very diverse group of people that said, enough is enough. I don't like what I'm seeing. And so I think President Obama, this is where the leadership comes in, recognized that this is not just a local response, that this required a national response. And so he put together a task force to address it. We ended up having venues all over the country. We opened it up to make sure people could weigh in, brought in experts, brought in community. But when we finished, one of the things we also did is now it's time for the federal government to put its money where its mouth was. So I was the director of the COPS office, which had about $500 million in grants, that I could then shape those grants around those recommendations so we can incentivize those agencies to do it.
Have interactions with policing, has it changed over those 10 years? Has it gotten worse? Has it gotten better?
As far as we know, police interactions have actually gone down over the last 10 years. However, police killings have increased quite dramatically. Folks are impatient for the change that they want to see, and this is particularly related to state and local changes. And we saw a lot of that being called for in 2020, rightfully. Changes like to use of force, right? So neck restraints, the use of no-knock warrants. There are policies officers are trained to use. And so we have to undo that work by spending more time on training and using that information, that data that is collected for the purposes of training. And we haven't really seen any of that, unfortunately, keep up big picture with what's being called for.
Anytime you can reduce a deadly encounter, even if that person is fired and shot at the officer, that means you almost died. And if you have to fire the shot back, that person almost died or did. And that can't, from a human point of view. Sanctity of life says we got to find alternatives and better responses.
You brought up alternate responses, and I would love for both of you to just dive into that a little bit more.
One of the solutions, if you think of 911 calls as pie, just taking a piece of that and redistributing. The framing is police right now are being asked to do too much too often. And frequently it's things that put themselves and their colleagues in danger. There's a variety of things you could call 911 for that aren't criminal and shouldn't be met with a criminal response. So something that has gained a lot of steam, a lot of traction over the last at least 5 years. We had really only a handful of alternative response programs, meaning programs that can tap into 911 dispatch and be dispatched instead of police, fire, emergency, whatever, and that are calibrated to the specific type of call. And now we're at over 130 by our count. We're looking to help jurisdictions continue to set up and sustain those programs. We've actually been working for the last 18 months with the city of Minneapolis. Right now, they're diverting about 9% of their 911 calls to alternative response. We showed them a pathway to get up to almost 50%. We're trying to take that show on the road. We've built out what is called the 12 Million Calls Initiative. Nationally, there's 240 million 911 calls every year. What if we diverted 5% of those calls to alternative response? That's 12 million calls. And so we're gathering all of the folks in the field who do this work, this kind of technical assistance work, try to reach out to other jurisdictions and say, maybe it's 10%. Maybe it's 15%, maybe it's 20%.
Share other examples of jurisdictions where things have improved by implementing some of these policies, and expand upon the difference between back-end accountability with police and accountability from the front end.
This kind of reform, this kind of front-end accountability, this kind of system changes. For Oakland, it was more back-end. Consent decree, federal oversight kind of things, but changes have been made. Crime is going down, uses of force are going down, all the things that you would want to see. Engagements are getting better. A lot of work to do. We saw changes in Philadelphia. We did an assessment in Philadelphia, back end again, because they had so many officer-involved shootings, and found out there was a lot of what we call threat perception failures. So we started addressing training that way. When I was in East Palo Alto, we did a reentry program, and because there was such high violence in the community, and as a result, we reduced our recidivism rate from the 70s to the 12%, and our homicide rate to almost nil. The principles are starting to work, and it does not cost officers their lives, and it doesn't cause crime to go up. It actually does the reverse.
What alternatives to arrest and incarceration?
There's actually 2 other cities that I think are really great models for alternative response programs and are kind of thought of as the gold star. Both happen to be NBA cities. One is Denver. They have a program called STAR, which takes a huge amount of call volume, is actually almost fully 24/7, 365 operational, and it's plugged in through 911 response. So if you call 911, you can get a STAR responder, a non-police responder. And then Atlanta, which runs a program called PAD, which is police alternatives and diversion. It's really something that's fundamentally happening all around the country.
It sounds like there's a lot of opportunity for teams and partnerships on this work in those communities. What role that the NBA family can play in this work?
The platform that you have is amazing as pro athletes. And it's not just the money. It is literally how people look at you, the respect that they provide to you, and you have a platform, a stage, and use it. And sometimes I think that platform can be the bridge that brings all the parties together to start looking at. I think there's so much we can do individually, at a franchise level, at an association level, at the league level, that can really go towards bringing people together. And in some cases, financially, if you can. Sometimes some organizations need just seed money. Some of your best thinkers are just community people who have been, like the old phrase, I have those closest to a problem or closest to the solution. They grew up there, they live there, they know it can work.
Don't forget to donate your time, donate your money, and put yourself in the struggle with everyone.